Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of this multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had shown for all of us, for our country. That is what this podcast series is all about. Well, friends, let's continue our discussion of Dr. Ambedkar as a political strategist, part 4. In this episode 18, I'm going to talk about post-compromise, that is, post-Pune Pact of 1932 breakup between Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. As you will recall, the Pune Pact of 1932 was signed on September 24, 1932. The very next day, in a public meeting of Hindus held in Mumbai, a resolution was passed stating, and I quote, "Henceforth, amongst Hindus, no one shall be regarded as an untouchable by reason of his birth, and that those who were so regarded as untouchables will have the same rights as other Hindus in regard to all public institutions," unquote. A week later, on September 30th, 1932, another public meeting of Hindus was held under the chairmanship of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya to form an All India Anti-Untouchability League. Its headquarters was supposed to be in Delhi. Chairman was industrialist G.D. Birla, and the General Secretary was Thakkar Bappa. Gandhiji was, of course, the inspiration behind this organization, and he renamed the organization later as Harijan Sevak Sangha. On November 3, 1932, the organization issued a press statement which stated, among other things, and I quote, "While the League will work by persuasion among the caste Hindus to remove every vestige of untouchability, the main line of work will be constructive, such as the upliftment of the depressed classes educationally, economically, and socially," unquote. The normal budget for a year was set up at rupees 6 lakhs. In February 1933, Gandhiji started a new newspaper, a weekly, called Harijan. He also started Untouchability Abolition Week in September-October 1932, and then Gandhiji himself undertook an all India tour mainly on foot during the period November 7, 1933 to July 29, 1934, and collected around 8 lakh rupees. These developments mollified Dr. Ambedkar's hostility towards Gandhiji. In fact, by November 1932, Dr. Ambedkar began really to appreciate Gandhiji's concerns about untouchables, except two things: his opposition to intercaste marriages and intercaste dining. Seemingly, there was a gradual convergence of their respective positions. Over the following year, however, viewpoints and agendas of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar turned out to be increasingly irreconcilable. This became evident from the critical assessment by Dr. Ambedkar many years later in 1945, when Dr. Ambedkar wrote the book titled What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the General Secretary of Harijan Sevak Sangha invited many Americans to showcase their work as, and he quotes, unrivaled piece, an unrivaled piece of social work that is being done by Mr. Gandhi for the welfare of the untouchables, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar, in his book, has demonstrated clearly by providing facts and figures how this tall claim was patently false. He gave many reasons for that. First, the intended budget of Harijan Sevak Sangha was supposed to be rupees 6 lakhs per year. Going by the published annual reports of the Harijan Sevak Sangha, the expenditure turns out to be annually less than 3 lakhs and 44,000 rupees. This was small as compared to Tilak Swarajya Fund, which had collected rupees 1 crore, or Kasturba Memorial Fund, which had collected rupees 1.15 crore, or 1 crore and 15 lakhs. B. Harijan Sevak Sangha claimed that they spent their funds on welfare activities for the untouchables. How significant was this expenditure? Spread over 50 million untouchables at that time, the welfare expenditure turns out to be 1 paisa per head. Needless to say that the contribution of Harijan Sevak Sangha towards the welfare activities of the untouchables was less than paltry, notwithstanding the tall claims which were made to the Western media by Mr. Gandhi and his followers. On the eve of his departure to participate in the Third Roundtable Conference, Dr. Ambedkar wrote a letter to the General Secretary of Harijan Sevak Sangha, Sri Thakkar Bappa. In his letter, Dr. Ambedkar placed some concrete proposals for the work of Harijan Sevak Sangha. First, there should be a campaign all over India to secure civic rights for the depressed classes, such as taking water from the public wells, in every entry in every village school, admission to village chowdi or the place where people get together, use of public conveyance, and so on. Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote, such a program, if carried into villages, will bring about the necessary social revolution in the Hindu society, unquote. He added, and I quote him again, without such a program, it will never be possible for the depressed classes to get equal social status. 2. According to Dr. Ambedkar, much of the misery and poverty of the depressed classes is due to the absence of equality of opportunity, which in its turn is due to untouchability. Therefore, the organization, he said, should work for bringing about equality of opportunity for the depressed classes. 3. The organization should attempt to dissolve that nausea which the touchables feel towards the untouchables, and which is the reason they have remained so much apart. The best way of achieving it, the letter said, is to establish closer contact between the two, between touchables and untouchables. Nothing can do this more effectively than the admission of the depressed classes to the houses of the so-called caste Hindus as guests or as servants. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the live contact thus established will familiarize both to the common and associated life and will pave the way for that unity which we are all striving to achieve. 4. Organization will have to employ a very large army of workers to carry out its programs. Dr. Ambedkar suggested that the task should be undertaken by workers drawn from the depressed classes. According to him, the touchables and untouchables cannot be held together by law, and certainly not by the electoral law substituting joint electorates for separate electorates. The only thing Dr. Ambedkar said in the letter that can hold them together is love. Dr. Ambedkar released the letter to the press, and according to Dr. Ambedkar, and I quote him, "To my great surprise, I found that no attention whatsoever was paid to my proposals. Indeed, my letter was not even acknowledged." Dr. Ambedkar found that in his absence, remember, during this period, he was attending the third roundtable conference in London. Dr. Ambedkar found that during his absence, the aims and objectives of the organization had undergone a complete change. For example, in the original aims, which were stated on September 8, 1932, it was clearly mentioned, and I quote, "carrying propaganda against untouchability and taking immediate steps to secure as early as possible that all public wells, dharamshalas, roads and schools and all other public temples declared open to the depressed classes." Unquote. That was the original objective. In sharp contrast, barely 2 months later, November 3rd, 1932, in the statement issued by the Chairman Birla and General Secretary Thakkar Bappa, it was categorically stated that, and I quote, "social reforms like abolition of the caste system and interdining are kept outside the scope of this organization." According to Dr. Ambedkar, this major change in aims and objectives could not have been possibly brought about without the consent, the knowledge and consent of Gandhiji. To quote Dr. Ambedkar, and this is very important, I quote him, "The only reason one can see is that the original program was most inconvenient to Mr. Gandhi. Removal of untouchability as a platform was very good, but as a program of action, it was bound to have made Mr. Gandhi very unpopular with Hindus, and he was not prepared to court such unpopularity. He therefore preferred the program of constructive work, which had all the advantages but no disadvantages." According to Dr. Ambedkar, constructive work had a positive advantage, and I quote him, "It had the possibility of destroying an independent movement which the untouchables had built up and which had forced Mr. Gandhi in 1932 to yield to its demands by agreeing to the Pune Pact. The so-called constructive work could make untouchables congressmen, and most gracefully too. It had, I quote again, the possibility of being converted into a plan to kill untouchables by kindness. This, as a matter of fact, is what has happened. Unquote. In September 1932, Dr. Ambedkar disassociated himself from the organization, relinquishing his seat on the board of the organization, Harijan Sevak Sangha. Subsequently, the two other leaders from the depressed classes also resigned from the board. Dr. Ambedkar observed that since the first batch of untouchables left, no attempt was made whatsoever by Gandhiji to appoint other untouchables in their places. And I quote him, instead, the management of the Sangha has been allowed to pass entirely into the hands of the Hindus of Congress persuasion. Unquote. And how did Gandhiji justify this change? According to Dr. Ambedkar, Mr. Gandhi propounded an entirely new doctrine. Gandhiji said, and I quote, the welfare work of the untouchables is a penance which the Hindus have to do for the sin of untouchability. The money that had been collected has been contributed to by Hindus from both points of view. The Hindus alone must run the Sangha. Neither ethics nor right would justify untouchables in claiming a seat on the board of the Sangha. Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar argued that the doctrine had insulted the untouchables. And I quote him, the ingenuity of the doctrine has not succeeded in concealing its gross and coarse character. Unquote. He then said, and I quote, it is pertinent to ask why at one point Gandhiji was anxious to have untouchables on the governing body of the Sangha, and why is he determined now to exclude them? This was a contradiction in the behavior of Gandhiji, which Dr. Ambedkar pointed out yet again. This feud between the two tallest leaders of our country, Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar, continued for several years thereafter. And we will have occasions to discuss those instances in the later part of the series. Well, friends, let's conclude this session here. But before I leave, let me remind you, if you like this podcast series, please like it, share it, and subscribe to it. So long until we meet again. Thank you. Namaskar.